Hello, and welcome to Conversations with Nick Thompson. You may know me from Netflix Love is Blind, but on this podcast, we sit down with guests from all walks of life to hear their story, remove stigmas, and uncover what makes them tick. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. I am your host, Nick Thompson. Today is another episode focused on therapy and mental health. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about that today is most of you probably know, if you follow me on Instagram or read a headline, that I'm going through some personal tough times right now. And I'm on a new mental health trajectory to help understand myself a little bit better, to work through a difficult divorce, to say the least. That's very public, and I'm learning a lot about myself. And what I think is super cool about having this experience publicly, for lack of a better word, is that I get to kind of do this in real time, but I get to share things I'm learning about myself and things I'm learning from other people by interviewing them for this podcast. I get to share all that with you. It's not always easy. For me, it's been difficult for me to open up over the years about my wellness and my mental health and the challenges that I face day to day and the journey that I'm on. But I get comfort in the fact that I get to share it with all of you, and most people are, by and large, relatively supportive and understanding that it's a process. One of the things that I do to help me process and keep it top of mind is I follow a lot of mental health experts on Instagram. They give these little, depending on who it is, like these little posts, and they're sometimes friendly reminders. Sometimes you learn something new. Sometimes you recognize a behavior you have or a behavior someone else has. But what I really want to do is not just recognize these behaviors or recognize how I behave or other people behave, but I want to understand the why. My personality type in general is the why is this happening? Why am I feeling this way? What is causing me to feel this pain or this angst in this moment? One of the people I follow on social media is a therapist. She has a master's in psychology. Her name is Alana Carvalho, and I actually had been following her for a few months, definitely a few months by the time we were going to talk here. But she reached out to me and asked if I would like to have her as a guest on the show. And I kind of geek out a little bit when someone I follow reaches out, which hasn't happened a lot. It's usually me doing it. But when they do, I geek out a little bit. Alana reached out, and I was really excited to have her on because she is an expert, not just in general mental health areas, but Alana is actually an expert in codependency and perfectionist. I was so interested. Her nickname is the Codependent Perfectionist, and that's where you can find her on Instagram if you want to check her out. One of the things I found so interesting in the way she talks, in the way she puts her message out on social media, was that it's very easy, in a sense, when you can identify something like codependency. You name it. I've talked about this before. When you name something and you put it in layman's terms, it becomes much more relatable, and then you can start to recognize and attach yourself to it. And, I've talked a little bit here and on Instagram about attachment styles and the learning that I've been embarking on there. And one of the things that was so interesting to me is that I do have some perfectionist tendencies, but also some codependent tendencies that I've noticed. So having outlet with an expert who has written a book about this topic. It's called The Codependent Perfectionist, A Guide to Parenting. Getting to understand a little bit more, what does it mean to be codependent? What are codependent relationships? What are those key things that you can recognize that you do, or that your family does, or that your friends do, so that you can identify a codependent relationship and hopefully find a way to better operate within that relationship and set up the proper boundaries, or help someone else in your life understand that you have a codependent relationship. So it's a very interesting topic, and I'm very excited to talk to Alana because she is putting out content on Instagram that resonates with me. I think it would resonate with all of you, but also just understanding the impact of a codependent relationship. What are those signs? And not just a relationship with a partner, but in your family relationships and your friends' relationships. What does it mean to be a perfectionist? Where does that come from? How do you learn to let that go and just be present in the moment? I'm really excited that we were able to dive a little bit deeper into these things because it's new to me. I know what codependency is. I know what perfectionist is, but I have no insight into where those qualities, or whatever you want to call them, where those stem from, and then how to recognize them, and then how to change your behavior, or how to understand how someone else behaves or someone else reacts is a reflection of them, not you. And that may be a codependent relationship that needs some work. Also, it turns out Alana is very spiritual. So she is, mixing some of her own well-being work, such as she practices yoga, using oracle cards, which we're gonna learn about hopefully today as well. But what I really wanted to do is have someone on who's an expert in codependency, where that comes from, the impacts that has, someone who's an expert with perfectionist, and how you can overcome some of the challenges that creates from a personality perspective. Without further ado, I want to bring this conversation to all of you. I'm really excited to have Alana on, and I would love to hear what you guys think. And if any of this resonates, I hope that you reach out to some of the resources, or at least give her a follow on Instagram, because I find it very helpful in my own journey here, learning to adapt even better to the challenges that I face on a day-to-day basis. Personally, I know I'm going to learn a lot from here, and I hope that you do the same thing. So without further ado, let's get to Alana Carvalho. Our guest today is Alana Carvalho. She has a master's in education in psychology, focusing all of her therapist work on those suffering from codependency and perfectionism. She's also the author of a best-selling book, The Codependent Perfectionist, A Guide to Parenting. And she's a podcast host of The Codependent Perfectionist, mother of 2 children as well. Thank you for coming on the show, Alana. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll get started today with a couple of fun little questions to kind of break the ice and get to know you a little bit. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
Awesome. I've been starting with this one a lot lately because I think it's fun. But what did you want to be when you were growing up?
So mine's kind of a boring one, because I'm one of those people who's like, when I was 5 years old, I said to my family, I'm going to be a therapist. And everyone was like, what? And so for my whole life, I kind of knew that this is what I wanted to do and what I was meant to do. And I just love it so much.
So what was your first exposure to, were you in therapy as a 5-year-old, or how did you even know that was?
I really don't even know. I just knew that I wanted to help people, and I must have asked some questions and found out that's what it was called. And then I was like, yeah, that's exactly it. I want to help people, with their feelings. And at that age, I just knew for some reason.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I feel like as a child, even knowing that was a thing, or having the wherewithal to go figure out that was a thing, is pretty much a destiny calling.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely built into me. I believe I kind of came into this lifetime. I was like, I'm going to be a therapist. That's what I'm going to do.
Sometimes it's predetermined, right?
Yeah, totally.
What were your jobs or what was your first job, I guess, as a kid? Young person.
So I've had a couple of funny jobs because my family's owned some businesses. So I've worked at my family's wine store. I've worked at my uncle's restaurant. And I always kind of did little funny things like that on the side. I also had a period where I worked at a gym. But in terms of my psychology career, I started off at 18 interning in I started with severe mental illness. And then I have done all sorts of things since then. Substance abuse, for quite some time I did substance abuse. And that was really where I kind of started learning about all the codependency stuff, in addition to my own therapy journey. And that kind of like skyrocketed things into where they are today.
And I also saw that you practice yoga. Do you have a specific type that you practice, or how do
Yeah,
you?
so I love hot yoga. I'm one of
Me
those
too.
people who loves to be tortured in that way. But there's just something about it that, and specifically I do what's called like a Jivamukti style yoga, which has a lot to do with like breathing, and is really like spiritual in nature. So to me, it's about like the balance of both like the physical practice, but also very much like the spiritual and mental health piece of it too.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's interesting because first of all, I love hot yoga. I haven't done it in a gym since pre-pandemic, but I do it on my rooftop in the summertime. So
Wow.
it's in Chicago and it's like 100 degrees, so it's very similar, and the sun's beating down on you as well.
Mhm.
But I agree with you, and to be honest, I found so I have a good friend who's a yoga instructor, and he has his own yoga business here in Chicago called Yoga on the Beach Company. He's actually got a retreat coming up, and we became friends because he was the instructor, and I was going to this class at my gym, and he was coming back from Ecuador on I mean, he's very transparent, like a failed attempt to relocate, and so he had to come back. And he was just very transparent about it. And I was going through, some challenges at the time, and I found hot yoga to be so much more, I guess, better, let's say, for my mental health
Mm,
than any of the other types that I had practiced before.
yeah.
And it really forces you to focus
Yeah.
because you might die if you don't.
Yeah, there's a real intensity to it.
Yeah.
It's very different than other types of yoga. And it's not to say like, I've definitely had like spiritual practices in other types, but there's something about this that you're right. It's just like you're in it and like you're focused on it. And it really kind of makes everything else have to go,
Yeah.
out of your mind in that moment, which is wonderful.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
What is your favorite movie?
So I'm totally not a movie person, which is like, I know everyone is like, oh my God. I'm like, I really haven't seen like some of the classics, which is so sad. But my goal in this lifetime is to make sure I sit down and see like the classic movies, because I really never have. I'm not, I don't know. It's never been my thing. I'm more of like, sit down and watch a good TV show.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair assessment, and I think those things have changed too. So I wanted to be a filmmaker when I was
Oh,
like 14 all the way through like 30 when I realized it wasn't going to
okay.
happen. But who knows? Maybe it will.
Mhm.
Um, but I shifted away from movies to liking TV shows more too,
Mhm.
and I spend too much time watching documentaries
Yeah.
too. I can say that
Mhm.
for sure. But I do feel like there's like a little shift in people enjoying TV shows now more than movies, maybe.
Well,
I
also we
don't
have
think
these like
that's.
amazing shows that are an hour long and they're kind of like watching a movie more like, like,
Hmm.
and I think it's sad to say, but I do think our attention span has like really dropped. So, like sitting through like a 2 hour long movie feels a lot more like challenging than a 1 hour long or a half-hour long show to me. And there's just something about it that feels different. I don't know. I like it that much more.
And to your point, they are like mini movies, and you take something like Game of Thrones,
Yeah,
and like each episode has the budget of a movie. So
seriously. Yeah.
yeah, so it is similar. So give me one of the classics that like everyone in the whole world but you has seen.
Star Wars. I've never seen Star um like stuff like that. I've never seen Braveheart. Like just
Oh
really
my
base.
God.
I know it's like, oh my God, like I'm missing out on like I think some of the basics of life. I don't know.
I feel, yeah, there should be like a onboarding plan for life where there's like a list of movies you have to watch to be able to participate in society.
Totally. And it's great because, my clients know that of me that like I don't really like know movies. So when they try to do like a movie reference, they're like, oh, I can't even tell you because you don't even watch movies. I'm like,
I quote Friends a
Mhm.
lot, the TV show, and if someone doesn't understand that, it's like
Yeah.
devastating. It's like devastating.
Yeah, I can understand. I'm like a Seinfeld quoter in that way. I
Ah,
love
okay.
Seinfeld. Yeah.
So would you say that's your all-time favorite TV show or?
That's definitely up there. I could watch Seinfeld at any time. That, I feel
Mm,
that way about Family Guy too. Like that to me, for some reason, like it always gives me a good chuckle and I appreciate that. Yeah, those are probably two of my favorites. Yeah.
that's awesome. What are you binging or watching right now that you would recommend to people?
I just started, well, I'm trying to be, up on what's going on. So I just started watching House of Dragon and I feel like it's good.
Okay.
It puts me back in the Game of Thrones days and I really enjoyed that show. So I think it's a good one.
That's true. I haven't watched it yet, and I'm like really. I realized I'm still very upset about the last
Yeah.
season of Game of Thrones, and I was late to the Game of Thrones party, but at that time, like that was must see. Like my Sundays would be planned around watching that show,
Mm-hmm.
even to the point where I made guacamole one of the Sundays and I cut my finger cutting open an avocado. I had to get stitches. And I literally called, I'm like, what's your wait line? Because I have 2 hours and I need to be back home. Otherwise, I'm just going to wait and come after.
Wow, that is dedication, I have to say.
Yeah, they got me home like with 15 minutes to spare. So that was good work there.
That's great.
All right, last fun, well, they're all going to be fun
Yeah.
questions, but last small talk question. Aside from watching House of Dragons, what are some of your favorite hobbies?
So I already mentioned yoga. That's probably one of my favorites. I love going to the beach, being in the sun. If I could be in the sun all the time,
Me
just like
too.
feel, there's something about like the energy of that that's amazing. Always love to read a good book. And I love to cook. I cook often. I love to try new things. I have a desire to get into baking, which may happen one day,
Mm,
but hasn't happened yet. But generally speaking, yeah, that's probably how I most enjoy spending my time.
that's cool. What's your favorite dish that you cook?
Um, so I would say mostly cook Italian type food.
Mm,
Tonight I'll be making some chicken marsala. I love to make like a good eggplant parm or all different types of pasta. I make fresh pesto sauce. We grow basil at my home, so we always do that. I also make
I love pesto
I
sauce.
make my own tomato sauce every year and jar it. So um, yeah, I love that.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. I love that you do your own sauce too. That's so. It's funny that you do that because I feel like those are the kinds of things that like people don't do anymore. You
Mhm.
just, it's easier to go buy a can of sauce at the
Right.
store, and I try to do those
Hmm.
things. Like I try to make. I may buy the can in the store, but like, why buy a pasta sauce when I could like literally make the same thing with a can or a jar of tomato sauce, and I have everything else that I want.
Totally. I mean, and
Yeah.
it's kind of incredible. So every year I do this. It's a family tradition. We've done it my whole life. Um, it makes the dish so much better that it's like hard to get away from it because you're like, oh my
Hmm.
God, I just miss that like fresh tasting sauce.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
That was well I've got a couple more actually. Are you of Italian heritage or anything, or is this just a love of pasta?
Yeah, so my mother's side of the family is Italian. Um, and my interestingly, they're Italian Catholic and my father's side is Jewish from Amsterdam. Uh,
Oh,
yeah, so
interesting.
I have an interesting mix going on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very cool. Have you been to Italy?
I have. I actually just went a couple weeks ago for vacation. Yeah.
Oh, so I noticed when I was over there, and it's been a couple years now, but all everything tasted so much
Yeah.
fresher. I thought of that when you said your point of like using your own tomatoes and your own sauce. And whatever they're doing over there, and I'm sure there's a lot, right? It's local. I'm sure there's more
Mhm.
local, probably grown a little healthier land, healthier or lack of, some of the chemicals we put in our food, but everything over there is just so much
It is.
fresher. It tastes so
I mean, the
good.
vegetables, everything's different. The eggs are different. It's kind of incredible. It's like, oh my God, there's just so much more flavor in every single ingredient. It's kind of mind blowing.
I was in 2017, I went to England, and I was astonished to see that eggs were at room temperature,
Yeah.
that they didn't need to be
Yeah, yeah,
refrigerated.
yeah.
I was like, I literally was like, I saw the carton on the counter and I just thought it was an empty carton. And then they went to cook eggs one morning. My friends that I stayed with, I was like, what are you guys doing? Like, you can't do that. Those are going to be rotten. And it's just crazy. It's all tastes so
Yeah.
different. It's so like food culture there is totally different. In a lot of places, you don't really have a need for organic because it's probably grown with general foods grown with higher standards than we have for, USDA organic here.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Absolutely.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, what I wanted to start with, and you kind of alluded to it a little bit, but I would love to get a little bit more on your background and your journey, and specifically like where you started, because you said you started with addiction when you were younger, and how you sort of made that transition to understanding codependency and realize that's where you wanted to make your mark.
Yeah, so my career really started after I got out of graduate school. I started working in substance abuse, and that was such an amazing experience. I mean, I learned so much. And interestingly, at the same time I was doing that, I was also like really into my own therapeutic journey. And my therapist really helped me see my own codependency and my own perfectionism. And while, I was seeing that in myself, I was also noticing it in my clients and my clients' families. So, because we were working both, sometimes with the person who was addicted, but also a lot of times with their families for support. And I just saw that there was so much codependency. There was so much perfectionism going on. And I was like, wow, like, I'm not somebody who has my own substance abuse issues, but wow, we're really connected in the place of codependency and perfectionism. And I just started noticing that it was so prevalent in so many of my clients and their relationships. And that really helped me start to focus on it with people. And I noticed that once I started doing that, people just got so much more clarity on what was going on for them that was problematic, and what they were really struggling with. So, oftentimes people with substance abuse issues, like I'll tell them that, underneath the substance abuse issues often is codependency and perfectionism, which is kind of incredible. So once they like peel away that first layer, they start to see like some of the deeper stuff that's really been going on for them, which helps them, truly begin to heal. And for those of us who don't, I mean, we may have other addictions of different kinds, but I find that this is such a core issue for just so many people. And so it's been really amazing for me to help other people along the same journey that I've been on for myself.
I think that's so interesting that you are able to take something, and I mean, this is a skill, like I don't have it, a lot of people don't, but to really kind of like peel back that onion and find out that, hey, I may not have the exact same substance abuse or challenges that you're facing, but there is a common ground, and you can meet them on that common ground and understand, it still comes down to these core fundamental
Yeah,
things.
absolutely. And, because people used to say to me like, oh, Alana, like why substance abuse? And, it's not like you have a substance abuse issue. I don't really understand. And I'm like, I so connect with it. And I think at the bottom of most mental health issues or substance abuse issues, we're all kind of struggling with the same stuff. It's like it all kind of comes down to the same thing. And it just looks different for every person. But once you can, I believe as like a therapist, you can really connect with that. It creates a really different dynamic for you with your clients.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's really intelligent and smart. Can you so there's a lot of mental health terms thrown around. I'm on my own journey of learning about attachment styles right now, which I really just learned maybe a month ago that was even a thing. And Even actually, my therapist was like, "I told you about this 4 years ago," but that's okay. That's my bad. So, what, in your view, how do you define perfectionism? How do you define codependency?
So, like in very basic terms, perfectionism to me is really just holding yourself to like really high standards that are difficult to attain. And oftentimes, like when or if we attain them, we kind of just keep moving the bar. So it's like, yeah, I did that. And then I need, there's something else I need to do to prove to myself that I'm worthy or I'm lovable or whatever it may be for us. So that's kind of that piece of it in a very basic way. And then the codependency piece is our enmeshment with other people in our lives. And what that really means is our oftentimes we have difficulty as codependents separating from those around us if they're not okay. We often like to make sure other people are okay. We like to fix other people. We like to give advice. And we have a hard time like separating out what's our stuff and what's somebody else's stuff. So, we may, in our relationships, it's often that it's common that we can lose ourselves in various ways and forget where to take responsibility for ourselves and where not to take responsibility for somebody else. Does that answer your question?
I am 110%, and I feel like you put that in layman's terms and common folks terms, which I think is really good. And I think I have my own obviously dependency issues and stuff too, but I feel like as a society we do, especially as a man. Like, I'm a fixer. You have a problem, I'm going to be like, all right, let's whiteboard this out. Like, let's go through this. It's my corporate lingo speaking, but like, let's map this out and solve this problem for you. And I think that everyone wants to put their spin and perspective on someone else's, and the reality is you and I could have the exact same things happen to us, and we react and take them completely different. They could be exactly the same thing. And because of how you're wired, how I'm wired, our experiences up to that point, it's going to be totally different. And it means that you need to respond differently. So
Absolutely. Everyone has their own journey. And, you touched on something like that's interesting because there's so many different ways codependency could look. And I do find that with men particularly, men tend to go towards being a fixer. And that creates a lot of problematic dynamics in relationships because women often just want someone to hold space and listen. And so they'll go to their partner and say like, oh, this is going on for me and I'm struggling. And then the partner will quickly go to, well, did you do this? What about this? How about, and then it creates a disconnect where, the person feels like unheard or unsupported. And often it's really just the person's codependency that's coming up and they don't realize what their partner actually needs in that moment. And it's not necessarily malicious, but it can be really, it can be really problematic in relationships, of course, and create a lot of disconnect.
I completely agree. Do you feel those, like, how would you broach that conversation or recommend a client or someone to broach that conversation with their partner if they weren't getting what they needed?
So I do a lot of work with couples, which I love. It's like one of my favorites. And oftentimes I'll help coach them through a way of, acknowledging that their partner is often not doing something malicious, that they're trying to be helpful. But that at the same time that they're trying to be helpful, they're not necessarily giving the partner what they need. So they need to express it that way and not, because what happens I find mostly is that the one partner who feels disappointed gets very emotional and then they speak to the partner from that emotion and then they're kind of like, why are you doing that? Or, whatever. It becomes a very like defense inducing conversation that doesn't need to be, right? So if we start off and we say, I recognize you really care. And that's why you're offering me like support in the way that you are. The problem for me is that I actually just really want you to listen to, what I'm going through and not give me any suggestions on what to do. Would you be willing to do that for me? And that's how I help people.
Just
Yeah,
sounds
it's like, it's just
straightforward.
a small
Yeah.
shift, but it creates such a different dynamic. And then the person's like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, that's what you're looking for. I didn't even know that's what you were looking for, you know?
Yeah, and then you have all this tension that doesn't have to be there because a simple sentence could have completely stopped anything from
Right,
derailing.
exactly. And I have to say, it's not like, people will often be like, oh, it's so frustrating that I wouldn't know how to verbalize that, and you kind of said it so simply, and I'm like, well, I've been working on this for a very long time, so that's number one, right? And number two, when I'm not emotionally invested in what's going on, I'm not having an emotional reaction, so I can be much more clear on it. And then the third piece is that we don't really learn these skills growing up. We don't really know how to communicate with each other. And that creates a lot of difficulty, especially if we came from a family who has really poor communication skills, maybe even like absent communication skills. We don't, or they just aren't great at verbalizing to one another what's going on for them. Any of those
Right.
dynamics, it's going to be difficult for us to know how to do it.
Right. Why do you think, that's a good point. I've never thought of this before. We have all these communication classes we take, probably starting in junior high these days, into high school, into college, or where, whatever your trade school is. You're going to have literally classes called
Right.
communication. Why are we not learning how to communicate with each other in school? Like, I never really thought of
Nick,
that.
this is like one of my secret dreams, is that like I go into schools and I help people learn how to do these basic things that help you function in the real world, right? That we're not taught. And it's so
Yeah.
hard for me to understand how we're not taught those things. And it's sad because I look at all of these people who are grown adults and they're like, oh my God, I don't have these basic skills. And I'm like, of course not.
Skills.
Nobody
Yeah.
taught it to you, right? So I'm there for the first time teaching you how to communicate effectively. But yeah, if we could teach teenagers and even young kids, I mean, I have a almost 5 and 7 year old, and I work with them on that stuff because I want them even at their age to make sure that they're saying things in a way that they actually mean it, or to get themselves heard, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I think your kids are probably going to grow up and be very successful if they're learning it at the ages of, you said five
Yeah,
and
yeah.
seven.
I hope so.
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting point. It's got my brain turning because, I grew up in I would say probably one of those non-communicative
Mhm.
homes. Um, and I've been in therapy for 6 years with the same therapist now, and I look back to who I was when I started versus who I am now, and how I can actually articulate how I'm feeling. And it's not easy, and it's always a work in progress. But like, I would never ever be able to do that
Mhm.
before. And I'm 37 years old, and so I've learned in the last few years. So I went through my entire 20s, and
Yeah.
it's wild. It's wild that it's basic skills, and we don't have
Yeah,
them.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the hard part is, like, if you grew up in a household that was codependent, which so many people have, codependents are notoriously terrible communicators because we struggle with being honest with people because we don't want to hurt people's feelings, or we don't want to rock the boat, or there's all of this different like emotional stuff that goes on. So if
Hmm.
you grew up in a household like that, it's very likely that learn to do exactly whatever your parents did, which was perhaps avoid difficult conversations and not say the
Hmm.
thing that needs to be said, or not address the issues that are so obviously in the room. And I think that's just such a disservice that we do, to our kids.
Yeah. It's more of a joke, but like, I used to, in my 20s, I'd be like, this doesn't seem right. Someone should say
Mm,
something. And then now I'm like the person who's like, this isn't right. I'm going
right,
to say
right.
something. And I feel like that's simple, but that's kind of the approach, right? Like, call out the elephant
Yeah.
in the room.
Well, yeah, because, I often joke with like my codependent clients because almost every single one comes into therapy complaining about somebody else that they expect to change in their life, right? So it's like, well, if only so and so would say this or do this, then things would be different. And it's like, guys, unfortunately, the only way to actually work on yourself is to let go of that, and like you're saying, you be the one who's saying the thing or doing what needs to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and letting go of the other person needing to be the one to do it for you.
I agree, and I think that's one of the other things I've learned is I can't change people. I can only change how I react to them, and that might be setting that boundary. Like boundaries have saved my life. Like I probably have more boundaries around people than anyone I know, but I feel like if you can't articulate it, you expect someone else to do something, all you're doing is going to be reacting in a negative way. And when you start reacting in a way that works for you based on how someone else is behaving, then you take back the control and you can set your guidelines or your boundaries or whatever you need with that person and then go from there. And you actually at least have a step forward instead of a step of standing still when you're expecting them to change without telling them what you
Right,
need.
exactly. Yeah. And to me, boundaries are one of the most important things in a relationship. So go you for doing that. And it's really hard work to put those in place, you know. It's scary, it's risky, you know. Some
Mm-hmm.
relationships can't survive putting boundaries in them, and you know, that can be really upsetting. But to me, it's what saves you from like resentment and what ultimately destroys a
Mm-hmm.
relationship anyway. And so, you know, people think like, oh God, but if I do this, then maybe the other person will leave. And I'm like, yeah, but if not, you're really like chipping away at this relationship anyway in other ways, right? So it's not that's not a better approach in my opinion, right? I'd rather put up the boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
and if the person leaves, it's clear, and we're like, okay, that's, you know, that's your choice and that's okay. Doesn't work for me to do it differently, unfortunately. And so, you know, we're all allowed to make those decisions.
Yeah, and then that's how you protect yourself because no one's looking out for you
Right.
but you.
Right.
And people, they have the best intentions of the world. They're not trying
Mhm.
to hurt you in some instances, but boundaries can help you keep
For
yourself
sure.
whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
One one thing that's interesting, and it was a few minutes ago, you were talking about like families and parents, and what what are some of the key identifiers that someone who is resonating with codependency conversation we're having right now, or even the perfectionism, like what are some of the things they can look
Hmm.
at or reflect on in their life that could help them identify that, hey, there might be some
Hmm.
codependency challenges that I experience in my family or with my friends or my
So the
spouse.
cool thing about that is I have a whole quiz on my website. My website's alanacarvalho.com. It's also the codependentperfectionist.com, which is easy for people, but it gives all of those questions that you can answer and then get some info on how codependent or perfectionistic you are. So hopefully that's helpful to anyone listening. But in kind of
And we'll link
okay,
that as
great.
well in the show notes.
In a basic sense, I think with the perfectionistic stuff, I would look at, um, you know, the constant need to achieve certain things, certain goals, feeling like your identity or your self-worth or your self-esteem is attached to like your success in any way. And, you know, feeling like you're just not doing good enough. You need to be doing more. You need to be, you know, I've had clients come in and say, Alana, I need to be more motivated. Like, you know, to me, those are all signs that there's something perfectionistic coming up where they're really um, becoming obsessive with the need to achieve versus content with what it is that they're actually doing in their life, which may be really, you know, might seem very small when they conceptualize it because of their way of thinking of things,
Mm,
but in general is probably a lot more than they realize. So that's kind of the one piece. Um, in terms of the codependency part, I think it's looking at um, how you're feeling in your day-to-day life and noticing if that's very dependent on what's going on with other people, what's going on in your relationships.
um,
You know, like I've often told people when I was in therapy with my old mentor, she once slipped me a little note while I was talking that says, that said, I'm not okay if you're not okay. Right. And so it's such a simple thing, but it's for codependence. Like we obsess over other people. We obsess over, how someone is taking care of themselves, how they're doing, how they're not taking care of themselves, all of this stuff that has nothing really to do with us at all. And then we
Right.
become really attached to it. And we lose ourselves, right? So if you find that you're often not taking care of yourself, you're putting putting other people first, you have trouble saying no. All of that stuff
Hmm.
are strong indicators of codependency.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, what would you say someone who's sitting here and they're like, "Oh my gosh,
Mhm.
that's me." What's step one? Like, where do you start to heal yourself and figure out what you need
Mhm.
to do? Because I know for me, like I've been depressed
Mhm.
my whole life as far as I can remember, and it took me forever to kind of like circulate around figuring out what was going on, because I just didn't have the skill set, to your
Mhm.
point earlier, the skill set to communicate how I
Mhm.
was feeling, or the skill set to like even know where to
Mhm.
start. And so, what kind of advice can you give to someone who's like, this resonates, I don't know what to do?
Yeah, I mean, so of course, as a therapist, I'm like, get into therapy, right? Like that's my favorite. And you're in therapy, so you understand. Like, it's so amazing when you can have, another. And of course, I've been in therapy, for many, many years as well. And that to me was the most impactful because it was somebody else who's listening to my story, who has um, no sweat in my game and can tell me how they
Hmm.
see it. And I think it's important that if you do want to work specifically on your codependency, that you have a therapist who really understands that. Not every therapist either, is well versed in it or even agrees with the naming of that, of, what that is.
Right.
So I would suggest, starting with a therapist who says, like, I work on codependency, I work on relationships in that way. Um, but aside from that, of course, like there's some wonderful books out there that can help you start seeing it. One of which is Facing Codependence by Pia Melody. I think that's a great one. There's support groups out there. I have some webinars on my website that I've recorded so people can just start listening and hearing different things about communication, like we talked about boundaries,
Hmm.
um, narcissism, which is something that can go hand in hand with codependency, all of that stuff so that you can just start exposing yourself. My podcast, obviously, I talk a lot about it. So all the different places where you can find that's topic of conversation, I would seek them out. But then definitely you have to have support, whether it's a therapist or a group. And it shouldn't just be your friends, because your friends are a part of whatever it is that's going on in your life. And that doesn't always mean that it's so bad or so severe, but you
Hmm.
need somebody that you can help look at all of your relationships with. And a friend, I find that there's just so many codependent friendships, so it's often hard for them to give you clear advice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's a role that your
Mhm.
friends play. And I think and this is probably codependency, they're
Yep.
enablers. They're enabling poor behavior and giving
Yep.
bad advice because they're, to your point, they're in your circle. They're a part of your problem. If it's even your closest friend that maybe knows you better than almost anyone, they still have a bias, and they're going to by default likely
Right.
support you, which means initially you're already not able to have like that outside
Yeah.
perspective, like you said, and then from there, like the bias just it plays a role.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's not always the best place to get support, which people are like, oh, but it's my friends. And I'm like, I know, but they love you and they don't necessarily always know how to best support you. So we have to figure out what we can get from them and what we need outside support on.
Yeah. So it's interesting about the codependent friendships because those are the ones for me that are like
Hmm.
boundaried. The people that ask for what I deem is too much or too much for me to give, or too much for me to support, or too frequent, or whatever. How do you identify like the codependent friends? Because that to me, it seems probably a little bit easier in some ways, but also more difficult to understand, because you're probably with them more in some cases. I don't know. I guess, how do you identify friends that you have codependent
So
relationships with?
there's a couple of different ways that I think that you could easily identify it. One is if you guys have trouble giving each other tough feedback. Like that to me signifies that there's probably some codependency going on, because in all relationships, we should be able to have difficult conversation of sorts, right? So when we can't, to me, that tells me there's probably some codependency going on there. So that's a big one. Another one, like you mentioned, is when there's a lack of boundaries, right? So
Hmm.
perhaps, the person is asking way too much, even though you've said no, or they're calling you at all hours, or they're endlessly telling you about the drama going on in their life, or, and sometimes it could feel very one-sided, some of these relationships
Hmm.
where, perhaps you have a role of being the supporter and the other person is the one who's coming to you for support, and then it's unbalanced in that way. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of times, it could be that the person, you know, is just not respecting what you need. Like you tell them what you need, or tell them what you don't need, and for some reason they are unwilling to give you that. That can happen in all sorts of relationships, of course. So
Yeah.
that's kind of some of the main ways I see it show up.
And what should people expect if they do learn some of these communication tools? Because I would imagine, and I've experienced this, I'm imagining you are, I may know it, but if my partner, my brother, my parents, my sister, they don't, you then have, again, an imbalance in understanding.
Sure. And I think, one of the things that happens often when we start working on ourselves is like we incorrectly assume that everybody else is like working on themselves too, and they all like it's like, no, actually it's just us, right? So we have to be mindful that, like, not everyone's looking at what we're looking at. They're not all figuring out the same things at the same time. But what I would tell you, and this, I think this is really important, is that what I have found is that when I work on my communication, it naturally changes how other people communicate with me, if that
Hmm.
makes sense. So even though they still may be really poor communicators, if I'm doing my part where I'm clearly communicating, and I know I'm saying what I want to say and what feels right to be said, I have a better chance at the other person joining me in some way there,
Right.
right?
Absolutely.
And sometimes that doesn't happen, right? But I would say a lot of times it does, and the person responds well to it, or they'll answer your question more clearly, or maybe they'll even like get more clarity themselves. Like there's really wonderful things that could happen there. We
Yeah.
just have to be mindful, I think, about our expectations for with others.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to, you can only control yourself. You can't control other people. And then if you still find yourself reacting to their reactions, it can be troublesome.
Absolutely. And
So I
it's,
had,
yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, you go
No,
ahead.
you go ahead. I was going to ask another question, so you can go.
I was just going to say, I think that's one of the hardest things for us is to like work on our reactions to other people, because, we personalize it so much, but the reality is that most people's reactions to us is actually more about them than it is about us.
Hmm.
Right. But in the moment, and of course, just in life, like it feels like it's about us and we take it so personally. But that actually really negatively impacts the relationship when we see it that way versus seeing ourselves separate from the other person and then saying, oh, what is this about them that this is coming up?
Oh, right. No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's the projecting.
Yeah.
Everyone does it. Like, you could be the most emotionally stable person in the world, and you're still gonna project sometimes. Unfortunately, it's
Absolutely.
human.
Yeah.
So you have a framework that you authored or founded, or however you want to say, it's the Codependent Perfectionist, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Can you talk about that? Like, what is it? How did you develop it? And how do you implement it with your patients and your community?
Well, it's kind of more like, I guess I call it a framework. For me, it's more like a lens with which I see things, which helps me help other people, see themselves. I call myself the codependent perfectionist because I want other people to know that I relate to their experience and that it's part of my journey. And so I'm not speaking down to anybody. I'm speaking with you. It's like I'm with
Love
you.
that.
I'm in like recovery from this stuff myself. I work on it all the time. And it's not something that it's like, oh, I've worked on that and I don't anymore. Like, no, this is with you throughout your life. And I always have to work on it. And so that's part of where it actually just came to me one day, which is amazing. I started writing my book and I wasn't quite sure like, where I was going with it. And one day it kind of just hit me. It was like, the codependent perfectionist, like that's what this is about, and then it kind of went from there. And so all of my stuff in some way connects to that, because for me it's like all of my relationships are impacted by it. And so when I'm helping clients or in all different ways, like I want to help them understand it by constantly, I'm teaching people about it. I'm helping them see it in their lives. And I really want to bring it all together. So a person's like, oh my God, that's my codependency. And then they get that they have to take a step back and really do some work there on it.
I think that's awesome. I also love that you didn't just say it. I can tell from our conversation in general, but like you're going through it every day. You're probably learning yourself every day, and you can keep people on a level and not be in a superiority position. And I bet that makes it super relatable. I know for me, the biggest thing for me when I picked my therapist was, and I told her this, I'm like, I know that this is, my therapy, but like, I need to like know you're a human being.
Right.
So like, I want to know, I'm not like bullshitting you when I was like, how was your week?
Yeah.
How are your kids doing? How, that stuff, because it builds that connection. And I would imagine like having that type of experience where you can kind of help them put it together because of the work you've done makes your interactions much more meaningful.
Yeah, I'm totally with you there. Like I come from the school of thought, which is different than other therapists, where like I want to be relatable to my clients. Like I'm happy for them to ask me that question. How's it going? How are your kids doing? I'll even share funny stories, or crazy stories, whatever it may be. And I'll do that throughout my work in different ways because I want people to get that they're so not alone with this. And even someone like me who is a professional and, quote unquote expert in this field, like it's like, yeah, I am because I'm working through it, not because, I learned all of this, great stuff.
Not because you read a couple books.
No. And, my clients would always say to me, like, how did you learn all of this? And I'm like, therapy. I actually learned it all in my own therapy, and if you have a great therapist, you will learn the same things. It makes you so aware and so able to see things clearly that like that should be the outcome of your therapy in so many ways. It doesn't mean that you leave therapy feeling good every week, because that's not going to happen, but you definitely should leave with a little bit more clarity than you came in with in some way.
Absolutely. I talked about this with a psychologist a few weeks ago, and this is something I'm realizing as I've gotten older, and people are more open to talk about therapy. People are more open to say how they're feeling in mental health. We're not anywhere where we need to get, but I think it's so interesting because I'm learning, again, my perspective, not an expert. I don't feel like some people that I know who have a therapist even have the right therapist. I was talking to a friend that was in town this weekend, and, some of the things she was sharing with me about her therapist, I was like, I know you relatively well. Like, it doesn't sound like this is the right type for you. So how would you recommend, especially you kind of alluded to it, if you have codependency and you're recognizing these things, find someone who specializes in it. But outside of that specialization, how can someone evaluate if they even have the right therapist?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And, it's funny for me because like, if I think back to my first therapist who, she passed away about 10 years ago, but when I walked in, she was barefoot actually when she greeted me at the door. And I was like, whoa, like what's up with this lady? And she was so eccentric. Love her so much. And she's the one who taught me so much about this. But, I recognized that, it's not that we clicked right off the bat. In fact, she actually scared me a little bit, which was good because when we got into the work, she helped me see myself in a way that nobody else ever had.
Wow.
And, it's not about being best friends with your therapist or thinking they're fantastic. It's like, and eventually, she came to be like a real mother figure to me in such like an amazing way. I mean, I think about her all the time. But she gave me such tough feedback, but there was so much love in it. And that's what I hope that my clients would say about me too, which is that they know that I love them, but I'm also going to tell them some really difficult realities and truths. And so to me in the work, you should feel challenged, really challenged, but you should also feel really loved. And if you can find the balance of that in somebody, like, wow, that's like the amazing combination. But it does take some time to get to know that person and know if they're going to be right for you. So I usually tell people, like, if when they're starting off with me, like, let's take a couple of sessions together and see if we feel like we're the right fit for each other. Because if not, it's not long term. We have to know, like, we're in this together, and I would want anyone to feel that way with their therapist. So, I would say give it a few sessions. Of course, see how you feel when you do your phone consultation. Off the bat, there should be, you're going to have some reaction, but see how you feel. And then, you have to decide, like, is this the person I really feel like I can, go to some deep, dark places with?
Yeah. I think that's a great answer. And not even the evaluation part, yes, like evaluating the sessions, but the way that you talk about, like, you got to be comfortable with the discomfort that's coming. And again, I only know my own experience, right? So this isn't meant to insinuate, but it feels to me when sometimes people get a therapist for the wrong reasons and they want someone to validate their feelings, validate their triggers, validate that, they're struggling, and I have days like this too. Like, I go in and, sometimes I decide before and I'm like, am I going to complain about my week?
Right.
Is that going to be the session today? Or am I going to talk about something meaningful? Because there's always an issue of the day. There's always an issue of the week, the issue of the month. There's always a friendship, family member, whatever. And until you kind of like get underneath that surface level stuff, to your point earlier about like uncovering codependency, you're kind of wasting your time, I feel like. So I don't know if you have any thoughts. That's also me just ranting. Do you have any thoughts on it?
No, you're right. I mean, I think that if it's open or, tell your therapist what's going on, of course. My hope is that at some point you recognize, or your therapist helps you recognize, what one piece that you might be playing in that dynamic, whatever it may be. Because if not, you just get stuck in this kind of victim mentality where it's like life is happening to you and, oh, poor me, and all of these things. And yeah, we all go through difficult times in life and we all can be victimized in various ways. But at some point, you do want to take responsibility for how to move forward, if nothing else, or how you may have played into a dynamic. And to me, that feels like some of the most important, piece of it. Of course, you want the healing and all of that. But if without that, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycles in our life, right? Like, we have to be willing to see ourselves, which is the hardest part of the work that most people don't want to do. And when you do that, then you can make change in your life.
Yeah.
Right?
That makes perfect sense. I don't remember who coined this, but like the shadow self. Like I resonate with that, whether you like that, agree or not. Like there's this person inside you who is like the real you, and then there's this person who is, I'm not saying, I don't want to say like facade or fake you or the brand or image you put out to the world, because they should be somewhat intertwined. But having the ability to look internally, it's hard. It sucks. Like me realizing literally 2 weeks ago, oh my God, I think I am the avoidant attachment style. And like being like, oh my God, like, yes, I do this, I do this, I do this, I do this. What happened? Or going through that work, it's hard. Like it's hard for me to even admit it, because I'm like very straightforward and direct with how I think about things mostly, but not as much as I thought I'm learning.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the hardest thing for us to look at ourselves and acknowledge, like, what are quote unquote negative things, but it's like
Yeah.
there's just, I can't even express how helpful it is to, how we can change our lives and move forward from doing that.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned it at the beginning, the spirituality
Yeah.
portion of your work, and then you have oracle cards,
Yes.
which I'd love to hear about. And because when I was looking at your stuff, I was like, is this like tarot read? Like, whoa, like, which is like cool. I think that stuff is so cool.
Yeah.
But, talk to me about like incorporating the spirituality portion of your work into what you do.
So spirituality is like so important to me in so many ways, but it's also like a really big part of my therapeutic work and how I kind of frame things with clients and talk about stuff. So I decided to create these oracle cards one day. I just had this like burning desire to give people the tools to be at home and get like instant feedback on something that they're struggling with. So I created this card deck, and oracle cards are kind of like a friendlier, nicer version of tarot cards for people who aren't familiar with what they are. But they're really created for like everybody to be able to use. You don't need any sort of understanding of them. But the cards that I created, they give an explanation of something codependency or perfectionistic related that you might be struggling with. And then they'll give you some sort of guidance or question to help you move forward. So they're really meant to help people, like guide them on their journey. They're a great supplement to therapy, or, if you're not in therapy at the time, you could still get some really wonderful feedback from them. So that's my hope for everybody. Yeah.
I really like that. And I don't know, can you do like one at a time, or
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
So kind of,
Because I think,
yeah, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, you can do it as part of like a daily practice where you sit down, you kind of close your eyes and you just pick a card to get guidance. You can think of a situation that you're struggling with and pick a card and see like what the universe is kind of saying back to you. And it's meant to be, they're synchronistic. It's like you get what you're supposed to get. So you just trust whatever the card is that you get and kind of see how that applies to your life.
I love that. One thing that I'm kind of, I put a lot of structure around my life, basically, because I need to have freedom, but I also need to have like structure in some areas where I know, like lately for the last couple months, every morning I'm going on at least a 20-minute walk, getting that sun, regulating the nervous system, all the benefits of doing that first thing in the morning. But I feel like when you get some of these workbooks and stuff, which I've looked at for different things, I've used in some instances, a lot of times it isn't like in the moment. Like I feel like grabbing a card, and you don't have time, right? And then you got to like sit down and you got to like open the book, you got to get a pen or a pencil. Like there's this whole process that stops you from doing
Right.
it. And I feel like with a card, you pick it up and you just on your
Yeah.
way. Maybe you pick it up like I could pick it up before the walk and think about it on my walk or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's meant to be like literally sometimes in between clients when I have like 5 minutes, I'll like grab my cards, just pull one out and like read what it says. And I'm like, okay, there you go. Like you just
I
get
love
that
that.
quick guidance and you kind of keep it moving and it's perfect.
That's very
Yeah.
cool. Do you have any other interesting use cases that you use them for or that your clients use them for?
I love like if I'm unsure of something in any way, I love to grab any Oracle deck and just get some guidance and say, okay, I'm thinking about this thing, like, universe, you tell me if I move this way, what may that bring to me, and just see what
Yeah.
kind of comes out there. They're just wonderful.
I think I'm going to have to get them.
Yeah.
I purposely didn't look into it because I wanted to just get your perspective on it after seeing that you had them on your website. So that's really cool. It's a good way to be mindful in the moment. And I like that.
Yeah.
I think sometimes, like, we spend so much time looking at things through a lens that, like, we don't necessarily need to, or that's beneficial for us. And something like this could, like you said, I'm thinking about X, grab this and just give you like a frame to look at it, like a different lens.
That's the hope. Yeah. It just gives you like a little bit of like guidance right there, like some way to focus and on a piece of it. And
right.
That I hope is really helpful. It has been for me. So, yeah.
I love that. So I wanted to ask you one more thing here, and then I'll turn it over to you and you can ask me anything. So you wrote a book a couple years ago called Raising Empowered Children. Can you tell us what was your process to decide this was what you wanted to write about? And the audience is parents. So what was your process of being, this is something that I need to bring to the world and on a grander scale? And, what could people expect if they picked up your book?
So yeah, the book, it's interesting. Like I talked about substance abuse earlier. It kind of stemmed from, I was working with a group of parents that their children had substance abuse issues. And I was like, wow, there's so much codependency going on here. There's so much perfectionism, so many issues around perfectionism. I was like, I have to write something around parenting. And I started to write a parenting book. And then I realized, no, actually, I really need to focus more heavily on the codependency piece and the perfectionism piece. And so the book actually has all three elements, and there's a part that's focused just on the codependency, a part that's focused just on the perfectionism, and then a part that's like really parenting related. But some of the wonderful feedback that I've gotten is people who don't have children have benefited from the book, where they're like, no, it's helped me see my own parent and how I was parented. And so, I think either way is a wonderful use, but the goal of the book is to help you get some clarity on how you may be parenting in a way that's codependent or perfectionistic, and then how to take a step back from that and create a way better relationship with your child through letting go of the codependency and perfectionism. And hopefully, and as I said, if you don't have kids, then it's just to help see it within yourself. And then learn how to work on some of that stuff.
That's wonderful. I think that's really good. Cool. That's nice. Yeah. Is there any questions you have that you want to ask me about?
Oh God.
I'm pretty much an open book.
Well, I'm wondering, like, how does all this sit for you, hearing all of this?
Oh, it's I have been on a mental health journey myself for my whole life. And it's so interesting because one of the main reason for wanting to have a podcast like this is I want to have these, ironically, not really, but conversations, because people don't know, and I don't know. And I have a natural curiosity. So once I, understood what attachment styles was, I immediately reached out and wanted to work with or talk with someone who had that, because I had a natural curiosity. If I have it, other people have it. Yeah. So listening to this and being able to kind of ask you these questions, I'm reflecting on, I have a codependent relationship with this person, or this person has a codependent relationship with me. And I think it's, and I've said this before in real life and maybe here, but we just need to start naming these things, because when you name them and define them, they're not vague and opaque anymore. And when you talk about codependency or perfectionist, that's why I wanted you to define it at the beginning, so that everyone knows what we're talking about. Because when you may recognize some of these things, but you can't name them. And if you can't name them, you can't address them. Right? They're just these ambiguous things that you you may hear something and ambiguously I have, my parents did this and now I'm doing it. And, but you don't know what it is. So I think for me, it's like hearing these things defined and then explained, and then being able to ask you, well, like, how do you address this? I feel like that's the most important thing, because we kind of know, but you don't know. Absolutely. And even me, who's been in therapy for 6 years and apparently learned about attachment styles 4 years ago, and it's very, and maybe I just wasn't ready, but it's just very enlightening, I think. And it simplifies it. And I think when you simplify things, your message can get out, and then it resonates with people, and then people can take action on it.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about the attachment thing, I think, we hear things at the right time when we're ready to, that's happened a million times, like both in my own work and with other people, where it's like, oh my God, I'm getting this thing. And I'm like, we talked about that like so long ago, but you hear it when it's time, and when you're really like ready for it to sink in, and that's okay.
Yeah. And that's exactly it. And that's okay. Yeah. And everyone is on their own journey. We are on our own journey, and they're not always going to align the way that you expect them to.
You got it. Absolutely.
And that's okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Do you want to share your information, where people can find you, where they can pick up your book?
Absolutely. So you can find me on Instagram, the Codependent Perfectionist. That's also my website I mentioned. Those are the two main places to find me. You can find everything on there, the podcast, the book, the Oracle cards, the webinars, everything's there. And also on Amazon, of course. But, feel free to check it out or ask me any questions. I love people reaching out and letting me know what they want to hear more about as well.
Thank you for joining me on another episode of Conversations with Nick Thompson. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to follow us and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Links can be found in the description below, and we can't wait to see you next time.